Have you ever tried watching the weather on TV with your friends? You should. There are those who love to complain. 30 degrees Celsius in October in Paris? That is insane. And others who are quite relaxed. Yeah, well, you're always talking about global warming. It has always been like this in the autumn, blah, 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 blah. For me, climate change is a very real issue. When I called my family in South Africa, they told me about the ongoing drought, which is particularly threatening to the vines. But I was keen to stay in my summer clothes, so I convinced myself that 30 degrees in October was fine. I was in a bit of denial. I wanted to be a child. I was like Peter Pan. In Neverland, his fictional island, nothing changes. The birds sing all the time, and the weather is always the same. This led me to think, this might be the origin of what we call climate skepticism. It happens to all of us. We reject change. But then, why do we sometimes behave like Peter Pan, like a child denying a reality that is obvious to others? Make sense? Make sense. Welcome to Make Sense, a leap in pop culture to explore societal challenges. A podcast from SKEMA Business School. To find out, I decided to talk to a real grown-up, Alijan Medjit, a professor and researcher of marketing at SKEMA Business School in the Marketing Interactions Research Center. Hailing from Turkey, he has worked extensively on psycholinguistics, decision-making, time perception, and the theory of mind. Let's join him as he guides us through our reality. Could Peter Pan have been a researcher?
Yeah, I think he can be a researcher. He has two important qualities. First, he is quite curious. Second, he is persistent. He likes to explore the unknown. And we know that research involves lots of trial and error, so there are lots of failures, and persistence is quite important. And we know, like, Peter Pan lives in Neverland, where time stands still, so he has plenty of time to do research. So it's quite nice.
So that makes me think of the people who don't want to accept climate change. I've read an article about Hamilton and Cass's model. People have got three possible reactions to the threat of climate change, and one of them is avoiding facing up to reality. Can we say that we're acting like Peter Pan when it comes to climate change?
So it's not only for climate change, I would say, these kind of reactions. So as you said, there are three reactions. So the first one is the total acceptance, second is partial acceptance, and the last one is denial. So denial is what you are referring to in this case. But it's not just specific to climate change. It involves every kind of distressing information, distressful information that we receive. So we can have all kinds of reaction, but the most common we see is, in the face of distressing information, is denial. And yeah, we can say that just as Peter Pan never wanted to grow up and face adult responsibilities, some people also show reluctance to confront the harsh reality of climate change and its associated responsibilities. So as a result, we see that they may resist making the necessary changes in their behaviors, or they don't reduce their carbon emissions, they don't recycle, they don't engage in the necessary behavioral changes.
Like Peter Pan, people prefer to avoid discomfort and making sacrifices, as you said. Could you give us some insight on this defense mechanism?
Peter Pan syndrome, also in the literature we see, it's a type of defensive denial. So it's a natural psychological mechanism that protects one's mental well-being when faced with overwhelming and distressing information. As I said, so we see this everywhere. In my research, I'm studying how people react to stressing information in the case of medical decision-making. So we see in the experiments that when people receive, for example, extremely outside the normal range test results, they do not start panicking. So they keep their stress at a manageable level so that they can make sense out of this incoming information. So this defensive denial, in some sense, it is healthy, because it allows individual to assess the situation, the threats, in a bit rational way. And it allows temporary comfort at the same time. Yet, if we rely so much on this defensive denial in the long run, this can be problematic because it prevents us engaging in precautionary behaviors, the behaviors that will, in this case, fight against the climate change.
Disney's Peter Pan begins with the philosophical reference. Peter Pan is playing with his own shadow like the slaves do in Plato's cave. They are convinced that their shadows are a projection of reality, whereas it's only their own reality. How do you explain the psychological reaction?
So it's an interesting question. So interesting reference to Plato also. So I would say in this case, the shadows probably represent the misconceptions that people have about their immediate reality. And by immediate reality, I mean the here and now. So people don't have a grasp of the psychologically distant scenarios. And in media, we see that climate change is generally portrayed as a long-term issue affecting distant places like we see the melting polar ice caps, right? And it's affecting the tropicals, but not necessarily Europe, not necessarily the US, immediately at least. So that's why people are having, I think, hard time understanding these psychologically distant scenarios. And by psychological distance, I mean the temporal distance in this case. So the time distance, we know that the effects of climate change we are going to see mostly in the 30 years and maybe in 50 years in the future. The second distance can be about the social distance. It's not affecting our immediate social circle. Right? Another distance can be the geographical distance. As I said, so we see in the media it's affecting the polar ice caps, but not necessarily that much Europe, not necessarily that much the United States. And the last important maybe psychological distance could be the hypothetical distance. So hypothetical distance is about how easy for people to imagine the scenarios. Because climate change, there are different kinds of scenarios, and they're rising sea levels, they're going to flood maybe the cities. So how easy for individuals to imagine those things? How likely that they are going to happen in their mind? If people think that these are just scenarios that are used in movies, it's never going to happen. So we are increasing the hypothetical distance. So, and whenever all kinds of distances, the 4 types of distance that I mentioned, so whether it is temporal, spatial, hypothetical, or social. So whenever we are increasing those kind of distances, we are creating a sense of detachment from the current moment and making it easier for people to downplay the urgency of taking actions against the climate change.
So you mentioned detachment. In Plato's allegory, like in Peter Pan, the slaves in the cave, they don't want to leave. They're happy with their own illusions. They're more comfortable with this than the truth. Is it a defensive reflex?
It is a defensive reflex, yes. And I don't know if probably you know, there's this George Michael song, Careless Whisper, right? So to the heart and mind, ignorance is kind. There's no comfort in the truth. The pain is all you'll find. So yeah, I think it's a kind of defensive denial. With this defensive denial, this defensive reflex, actually people create this temporary comfort, this deceptive happiness, and the diffusion of responsibility so that they don't feel responsible for their actions. So yeah, I would say that it's part of this defensive reflex.
In the beginning, Peter Pan succeeds in convincing Wendy and her brothers to accompany him to Neverland because they do want to believe that this fantastic world exists. They accept it a priori because they are enthusiastic about it, but other people have refused to follow Peter Pan in his surrealistic trip. So why don't we all react the same way to climate change? Do we have this predisposition to believe or not to believe, to be a believer or a rational person?
Yeah, I think we cannot say that there is a predisposition to believe or not to believe. So we are not born with certain mindsets, right? So these things, the predispositions that we have, they are basically an interplay of internal psychological or external social factors. So, for example, we know that in many countries, the climate change has become a politically polarized issue. If you look at the USA, we know that certain groups, like maybe Republicans, they tend to believe less in climate change compared to Democrats, right? So it's basically the social circles that you choose for yourself, and then you tend to identify with those circles. You create an ideal, and then you identify. And then you start displaying the characteristics of this prototype in your mind. So how does a Democrat look like? How does a Republican So if you think that a true Republican should not believe in climate change, then you will assimilate into this prototype and maybe start believing less and downplaying the importance of information, also showing that there's climate change. So I cannot say that there's a predisposition that's natural, that's inherent, but we develop those maybe beliefs or disbeliefs thanks to our social circles.
Okay, so what shapes individuals' misbelief in factual information? Is this something that could stem from conspiracy theories like skepticism of moon landings in 1969 being fake, or even to skepticism of the COVID vaccine, which we've experienced recently? I mean, what in fact is the psychology behind a person misbelieving factual information?
I think there are two main reasons for this misbelief, and we can draw parallels between this misbeliefs in COVID vaccine and like moon landing, as well as the climate change. The first one, I would say the confirmation bias. So this is something I touched upon in my previous answer. So once you create an idea of yourself, so you have an idealized version of yourself, this is your ideal self-concept. Your ideal self-concept displays certain characteristics. And if, as part of your ideal self-concept, you tend to portray yourself, again, as a Republican or someone with a political ideology favoring free markets, for example, maybe you will tend to downplay the importance of information that is favoring the actions against the climate change. So confirmation bias is the first one. The second one, I would say the distrust in institutions. So especially in recent years, we see that some of the mainstream institutions are seen untrustworthy. And people turn to some kind of fringe sources whenever they do not have the truthful information in their surrounding environment. One example is, for example, they say that COVID vaccines can alter a person's DNA. So this is not truth, but it has become a common belief. It was shared and also on the social media. You were asking something about the conspiracy theories. So we know that the conspiracy theories can play a role in this case because people have epistemic needs. So epistemic need in this case, it's need for certain kinds of information. And whenever there is a crisis in individual's environment, people tend to feel certain. And this certainty, sometimes they can assure by satisfying their epistemic needs. So their need for knowledge. In this case, people maybe sometimes they cannot differentiate between the good source from the bad source. And we have plenty of bad sources also on the social media. And they may turn to those sources and they may come to believe because they provide certain kind of security. They provide certain kind of certainty. And it provides a certain kind of closure also. And it closes this uncertainty chapter for the individuals.
Would you say that climate skeptics are a danger for the fight against climate change? When Peter Pan lands on Big Ben's clock face, he sets the time forward, right? And this could be seen in our scenario as his refusal to believe in the fast accelerating or ticking climate clock. So is belief or non-belief powerful? In other words, can skeptics complicate the fight against global warming?
Maybe it's important to note that climate skepticism is a diverse viewpoint, so it's a spectrum. It's not a binary category. We cannot put people into categories. This is a climate skeptic. This is a believer. So it ranges from, I would say, mild skepticism to outright denial. And some people are open to change, and some people are not open to change. So that said, I would still say that it can complicate things. Especially, we have lots of people who are outrightly denying that there is a climate change. There are two reasons. One of them is the obstructionism. So obstructionism, it's those that are influential people who do not believe in climate change. They occupy important positions in the government, in NGOs, and they can actively obstruct the climate action initiatives. The second reason can be doubt. Although there is nothing wrong about sharing your opinion on social media, we tend to hear a lot about the climate skeptics in the media, whether it's social media or it's classic, like traditional media. So this may slow down the efforts to address the climate change, maybe, because it sows doubt and it delays action.
Absolutely. The analogy between Peter Pan and the distrust of climate change can be compared perhaps to the rehabilitated Captain Hook. He wants Peter Pan to leave Netherland, the land of the dreams. So let's imagine you are Captain Hook. How would you get Peter out of Neverland?
In this case, we need to convince Peter Pan that the idea of leaving the Neverland is the thing to do. So we need to sell him this idea. And selling ideas, selling products, selling services, it's something that we do very well in marketing. We have even a special theory of persuasion. And according to this theory of persuasion, individuals can be persuaded two different ways. So you can persuade them using a peripheral route. So what is peripheral route? So peripheral route is the peripheral cues that you see in the ads. So if you want to sell an Evian bottle of water, for example, what is central characteristics of Evian bottle of water? It satisfies your thirst. But in the ad, do you see arguments only about satisfying your thirst? Not really. There is music, there are little babies, there is this fun element. So this is what we call in marketing the peripheral cues. So peripheral cues, by creating positive associations around the product, around an idea, around the service, it sells the product. The downside of the peripheral cues is that people are not using elaborate processes. So they are not using their mind, basically, to reason about the product. So those changes, that's why they are not permanent. They are quite temporary. So if Evian convinces me of buying their product because of those music, maybe, lovely music or lovely babies, cute babies, so this change is going to be very temporary till the time I buy, till the time Volvic advertises, probably with better cues, peripheral cues. The other route that I was mentioning is the central route. So central route is about conveying solid arguments so that people change their minds. So in the case of climate change, we can provide individuals with scientifically validated information from reputable sources. And in this case, people can get convinced using the central route. So there are two routes to the persuasion, and I would say this central route is much more important. There are some things to watch for, two things to watch for. The first one is the information overload, because we don't want to give so much information to consumers, in this case to general public, because we know that once you give so much information, they get overwhelmed. People can only probably process 5 to 8 pieces of information. So more than that, it will be just not useful. Second, you need to be clear in the message. So you need to be sure that general public understand what climate change is. So climate change is not the same thing as weather change, right? So we have this one fun scene. I think it happened in 2015 in Oklahoma. One state senator, he brought a snowball into the Congress, saying that, well, you can see that there is this snowball, it's very cold and it's not melting. So I'm not sure there is a climate change. So, which is quite interesting. So people, the general public, should be aware of the differences between different terms, different concepts, whether it's climate change or weather change we are talking about.
I was just wondering, are there other ways to get Peter Pan out of Neverland? In other words, to see the reality, other psychological ways?
Yeah, we were talking about psychological distance. So anything that you do to reduce the psychological distance can push people to take actions against the climate change. So it can be, again, the temporal distance. So we shouldn't underline the fact that the climate change is happening, but the effects are going to be seen in 50 years, in 100 years. We should emphasize the fact that the immediate effects are already here. There are other also distance types that we talked about. So we had the social distance, we had geographical distance. So it's not just about the polar capes, but it's about where you live. So we should underscore probably that it's affecting people's immediate circle. It's affecting where people live currently. And the last one is the hypothetical distance I was discussing. So how easy it is people to imagine those scenarios. And I think one thing that can be useful is like using movies. So we know we have this wonderful movie, The Day After Tomorrow, using marvelous scenes, effects to display how it's going to be, maybe, after the climate change. So these are the things that we can use. Related to time, another aspect that we can use, maybe, to change individuals' actions is to change how they view themselves with respect to time. There are two general ways. The first one is the time-moving perspective. Time-moving perspective is that individuals tend to view themselves as a stationary agent on a moving timeline. So they are themselves standing still, and the time is coming from the future and going to the past. And ego-moving perspective is that the time is stationary and I am the moving agent. I am coming from the past and moving to the future. There is one question that we ask to uncover what kind of a perspective that individuals are relying on. I can ask you maybe right now the question.
Go ahead.
So imagine, Mary, there is a meeting next Wednesday and the meeting has been moved forward 2 days. Which day is the meeting now?
Monday.
Monday? Really? So there are 2 possible ways to answer this question. You can either say Monday or Friday. So if you say Monday, it means that you are adopting the time-moving perspective. So what is time-moving perspective? Time is coming from the future, going to the past. So you apply this forward to the time, so which means that meeting has been moved forward 2 days. Given that time is coming from future to the past, meeting is moved from Wednesday to the Monday. If you are the one who is moving on a stationary timeline, then you apply this forward to yourself and you answer as Friday, because you are the one moving and you are coming from the past and going to the future. So we know from research that people adopting the ego-moving perspective, actually, they are quite responsive. Whenever there is a crisis, whenever there is a challenge, they act. They are more agentic. The good thing is that we can switch people from one perspective to the other one. Although they may adopt certain chronic time perspective, in this case maybe yours is time-moving perspective, we can use language to make people switch from one time perspective to the other one. So, for example, if I'm saying we are approaching the deadline, by this sentence, I'm implying that we are in an ego-moving kind of context. If you're saying the deadline is approaching, then we switch the perspective, and now we are in the time-moving perspective. It is the deadlines, things on the timeline that are approaching to us. So using an active voice, making the individuals active in language can also shift the perspective. And these are some unconscious effects that can have immediate effects and maybe more long-term effects in the fight against climate change.
So would you prefer Wendy's approach to get Peter and other people out of Neverland? In the movie, Captain Hook embodies people who deny climate change as he mocks the children and Peter Pan for their beliefs. He's always complaining about Peter Pan. He tries to expel him from Neverland with a bomb. Meanwhile, Wendy has a more rational approach because she is encouraging kids to leave Neverland, and she's saying that they need to sleep, they need to grow up. She reminds them that they have a mother. And Hook treats children like children, so they react like children, whereas Wendy talks to them as if they were adults, and they behave like adults and more rational people. So in the movie, Hook fails and Wendy wins. Would you agree?
I agree. So I think it's true. So it should be like this. At least this is how we teach in marketing. In marketing, we say that it's a spectrum. So you have a toolbox to change individuals' behavior. And on the spectrum of toolbox, on the very extreme sides, you have forced change and you have persuasion. So persuasion is just what we talked about, and I said that using rational arguments, solid arguments, it's something that we appreciate a lot, and it has permanent behavioral change. So what Wendy does in this case, it is quite right thing to do. Whereas for the forced changes, it's kind of like the sticks and the carrots. I would say it's like the sticks in this case, and as part of this positive punishment, we see that it can work sometimes with individuals. So if you do this, you will get this. If you arrive class late, then I will cut 5 points from your grade. So this is kind of positive punishment, and it doesn't work very well. It doesn't resonate well with students. In this case, I don't think it will resonate well with Peter Pan, and it won't resonate well with also people in the fight against the climate change. Because again, the positive punishment we see so much similar in terms of its effects on human behavior as we see for the peripheral cues. So it's going to be temporary. So the moment you remove those things from the system, then people will get back to their usual kind of behavior. So I think what Wendy does is right, and this is the right thing to do. Probably she took some marketing courses. So yeah, I would say using solid rational arguments, using persuasion is the way to go to fight against the climate change.
Thank you, Ali Jan. That was super interesting. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for your lovely questions.
Easier to understand with pop culture? Coming soon, a new episode is on its way. I already know the theme, and I have a feeling you will like it too. So subscribe. It's the best way to ensure you are notified when it releases. To learn more about SKEMA Business School, you can visit the school's website at www.skema.edu.